If I were to ask you, which of these two characters is the villain of the story, who would you choose? If you chose the guy on the right, you would surprisingly be wrong. Despite his grotesquely horrific appearance, he is just another victim of the man on the left, who is quite literally one of the most irredeemable and narcissistic fictional characters I have ever encountered. Mouthwashing is a game that plays into the old adage of never judge a book by its cover, but it also takes it one step further. For you see, not only is the main antagonist the person you least suspect, but he is also one of the main characters you play as. The game utilizes the approach of non-linear storytelling, where the events of the game are presented to you out of chronological order. Through this method, the player is able to slowly piece together that they were in fact the villain all along. This unique style of narrative forced me to engage with the characters and story much more than I normally would have, and overall intensified the impact of key story moments. Mouthwashing is a story about a man who refuses to take responsibility for his actions, blinded by delusions of grandeur. His egocentric ways lead to the downfall and destruction of all those around him. And by the time the man does see the error of his ways, it is far too late. His feeble attempts to fix things are more of an afterthought, an action performed simply to remove the bad taste left in his mouth. Mouthwashing. While the story of Mouthwashing may at first seem fairly straightforward, there are tons of details and symbolism that the developers have masterfully weaved into the narrative, a lot of which you might have missed on a single playthrough. Certain things in the game can only be picked up on after playing through it a second time, with the knowledge you acquired on your first run. In this video essay, I aim to critically examine the tragic events of Mouthwashing, with the context of the overarching plot in mind. Using this approach will allow us to gain entirely different perspectives on events and characters that make much more sense in hindsight. I also have some potentially controversial thoughts to share about Jimmy and Curly, so stay tuned for that. The events of Mouthwashing occur in a futuristic setting where long-distance space travel has become commonplace. We follow a cast of 5 crew members on board the Tulpa space freighter. They are employees of a space shipping company called Pony Express and have been tasked with transporting a large shipment of unspecified goods, which is going to take approximately 382 days. In addition to this basic information, the game opens with a single phrase that reoccurs throughout the story. I hope this hurts. We are then suddenly thrown into the cockpit of the Tulpa, and are informed that an orbital body has been detected near the ship. We are instructed to turn the ship to the left to avoid impact. However, the only option available to us is to steer it right. On my first playthrough of the game, I was genuinely baffled by this, and spent a good few minutes trying to find a way to steer the ship left. However, I soon came to the realization that whoever we are playing as at the moment must want to intentionally crash the ship. Proceeding with the lunatic's plan, the ship engages autopilot to correct its trajectory. But by using an emergency key meant only for the captain, we are able to override the autopilot setting. As the loud sirens of the Tulpa signal our impending doom, we walk out the cockpit into what seems to be a looping corridor. This is one of the game's many Bizzaro sequences that do not actually occur in reality, but rather reflect the mental state of your character's mind. We still have no idea who we are playing as, although they seem to have a strange fixation with the shipping company's mascot, Polly, a figure resembling a cartoon horse. The horse seems to be following us, and as much as we try to run from it, we can't escape it. Alongside Polly, we can hear the echoes of a crying baby bouncing off the ship's corridors. This is major foreshadowing for later on, so keep this in mind. The Tulpa's condition continues to deteriorate, much like our character's mind. We are then confronted by a heavily distorted version of Polly. The chapter ends, and we are now transported to a scene 2 months after the ship crashed, where we are introduced to 4 members of the crew: Swansea, Anya, Daisuke, and Jimmy. The player is given control over Jimmy, the ship's co-pilot, who has now proclaimed himself as captain following the crash. The crew are arguing about whether they should open the contents of the ship's cargo hold, as they lost a significant portion of their supplies following the crash. Swansea is the only one opposed to the idea, fearing a deduction in pay. However, his vote is quickly overturned by the now acting captain. The Tulpa has sustained heavy damage as a result of the collision. Several parts of the ship have been covered by emergency foam, sealing any breaches in the hull. In addition to this, the ship is no longer able to move. They only have 4 months of food left, and an even more limited supply of air. Despite this dire situation, Daisuke remains almost foolishly optimistic, speaking as if their survival is guaranteed. He is interned to the ship's mechanic, Swansea, who appears to be less than pleased by Daisuke's presence, viewing him as more of a hindrance than help. Entering the medical bay, we meet the final crew member and former captain of the ship, Curly. He has suffered horrific injuries due to the crash. The ends of all 4 of his limbs have been lost or amputated, rendering him immobile. Almost all his skin has been removed or burnt off, exposing the underlying muscle and tissue. He lays in a pool of his own blood, unable to speak and barely able to move. But despite all this, his one uncovered eye remains intensely fixated on Jimmy, tracking his every move. Anya, the ship's nurse, has done her best to tend to Curly's wounds and keep him alive. But the pain is becoming too much for him to bear, and he seems to be resisting the painkillers. Anya understandably does not want to force Curly to take the medication, but Jimmy just belittles her and questions her qualifications. Anya is initially presented to us as someone who is extremely timid and soft-spoken. Her body language is closed off. She frequently avoids eye contact and is very reserved with her speech. It's almost as if she's afraid. Jimmy reluctantly agrees to give Curly his medication, prying his jaw open and shoving 10 milligrams of oxycodone down his throat. The noise alone is enough to send Anya running. We find her kneeling on the ground and panting heavily. This event seems to have triggered something traumatic within her. It is then revealed that it was Captain Curly who crashed the ship, or at least that's what the crew believed to be the case. Jimmy questions why they are even keeping Curly alive at this point, to which Anya responds, "I have to believe that our worst moments don't make us monsters." This line holds great significance that we will expand upon later. Following the advice of Anya, Jimmy heads to the cockpit to retrieve a code scanner that will give us the code to the ship's cargo hold. On our way there, we find Swansea standing menacingly in front of the utility room. He is one of the only crew members to stand up to Jimmy and does not waver even when faced with the acting captain's power trips. Swansea has marked the utility room as off limits, claiming that the entire room is filled with emergency foam, and that he can't let anyone in out of fear of causing a leak. Respecting Swansea's role as mechanic of the ship, Jimmy trusts in his judgment and proceeds onwards with the task at hand. After collecting the code scanner from the cockpit, we use it to reveal the emergency code to the cargo hold. After inputting the code, the large metal doors slowly open, but before we can see what's inside, the chapter ends. Hey you. Yeah, you. The one watching the video. You're enjoying yourself, aren't you? Why don't you take responsibility and subscribe? Come on, it'll only take a second. Everyone's counting on you. Captain's orders. We are now taken back to the past, 7 days before the crash. Our perspective has shifted to that of Captain Curly, who is undergoing a psychiatric evaluation conducted by Anya. She seems to be much more confident and comfortable around Curly compared to Jimmy. The captain himself comes off as a fairly decent guy, so we're not exactly sure what drove him to crash the ship. After declaring that Curly is fit to continue on with his position, Anya laments about having to do Jimmy's evaluation next. He does not seem to take her question seriously, giving bizarre answers, like having a sexual attraction to cartoon horses. Curly offers to conduct the evaluation in Anya's place, claiming to have known Jimmy for quite a while now. Before we leave, Anya hands us a note from Swansea, who seems to be frustrated to say the least. Checking up on our mechanic, we are presented with an oddly comical scene. Daisuke has gotten himself stuck in emergency foam while trying to fix a broken vent in the utility room. Swansea would have cleaned up the mess himself, but the ship's axe is only accessible through the captain, more specifically through the code scanner. It would seem that a great deal of tasks can only be performed by the ship's captain, emphasizing the importance of the role, as well as the disparity between Curly's position and the rest of the crew. Using the axe, Curly frees Daisuke from the foam, shortly after which he is thoroughly reprimanded by Swansea, who seems to be genuinely concerned for his safety. He proclaims the vent strictly off limits, as its insides are almost completely collapsed. We also get this hilarious shot highlighting Swansea's large protruding abdomen as Daisuke takes an unintentional jab at his weight. This is one of the rare moments where mouthwashing made me smile. Sadly for the crew, these moments are few and far between. Curly snaps us back into reality, warning Swansea that an incident like this could damage the ship's cryogenic pods, which are the crew's last means of survival in cases of emergency, preserving their lives for approximately 20 years. Note that there are only 4 cryopods, despite there being 5 people on the ship. This is because Daisuke was a last-minute addition to the crew, and the tulpa was only designed to carry 4 members at a time. Evidently, Pony Express did not seem to care about this fact. After dealing with the mechanic and his intern, we meet with Jimmy, who has wandered into utility after hearing all the ruckus. His appearance is fairly ordinary and unassuming, although there's something oddly apathetic about his face. Curly informs Jimmy that he will be conducting his psych eval. The two seem to be on friendly terms, freely joking with each other. Jimmy wants to continue their discussion somewhere more private, so they head to the cockpit. While Curly is on his way there, the music slows down, and the door that normally leads into the cockpit takes us down an extremely long staircase, possibly indicating that this conversation with Jimmy is something he has been dreading, or that he has a lot on his mind. The staircase eventually ends, dropping us into a large pool of water, which reflects the red sky above it. Several ladders and warning signs begin to appear all around Curly, the significance of which we will explore in his conversation with Jimmy. The hallucination ends as we run towards a rising sun. This image looks very similar to the one kept next to Curly's bed in the present. Entering the cockpit, the captain and his co-pilot breeze through the evaluation, not taking the questionnaire entirely seriously. The two friends then begin to chat about life off the record. Jimmy seems to like it here. He feels in control of things, which we will see to be something that is very important for him. He also expresses sentiments of feeling undervalued, forever in Curly's shadow. The captain's view about his position is a bit more mixed. He has been having doubts about whether this is the right career path for him, if this is all he will ever be. He has reached the end of this ladder, but now realizes this may be the wrong ladder entirely. Jimmy seems to somewhat understand Curly's thoughts. but at the same time still feels undermined. The captain seems to put a lot of faith and trust into Jimmy. Among all the crew members, the bond between them seems to be the strongest. While at face value this may seem like something good, it could potentially lead to bias and favoritism later down the line. Their heartfelt conversation is eventually interrupted by an incoming message from Pony Express. Trying to read the letter from them ends the chapter. The next sequence does not seem to fit into the timeline of the game's events, and was simply put in as a way of providing context. We are presumably in the ship's cargo hold, surrounded by seemingly endless aisles of cardboard boxes. At the center of the room is a lone old-fashioned TV playing static. Switching the dial, we are shown a variety of different videos that highlight the themes of mouthwashing. An ad incentivizing employees to work hard and generate their company a profit, reflecting the true nature of money-hungry corporate companies like Pony Express, who outwardly claim to value their staff, but inwardly only care about themselves. An illustration of a black hole, formed after the death of a star, engulfing everything in its path. In this case, Jimmy would represent the black hole, formed after the metaphorical death of Curly as captain, bringing about the destruction of everything around him. The atom, a particle so small and seemingly insignificant that in reality holds great significance to the universe. Much like how a single problem you perceive to be trivial in the greater scheme of things could lead to disastrous consequences later down the line. A butchery filled with the carcasses of dead animals and dancing skeletons, likely foreshadowing the tragic events that will transpire in the future. Lastly, a snake oil salesman who promises a product that will solve all your problems, while actually being completely ineffective, very similar to a certain dental hygiene product. Back to the present, the crew discovers what they have been transporting all this time: mouthwash. Thousands of boxes full of it. The crew are left in a state of disbelief. They have been risking their lives for such an ordinary and mundane item, an ineffective one for that matter. Anya remarks that the sugar content of the mouthwash offsets any potential use as a disinfectant. It is almost completely useless to them, other than a measly form of sustenance. But Swansea seems to have other ideas in mind. Noticing the 14% ethanol content of the mouthwash, he pops the lid off the bottle and takes a healthy swig of Dragon Breath's concoction. 15 years of sobriety down the drain. But he doesn't seem to care, having already come to terms with their bleak fate. After receiving the news from corporate, Curly is now on his way to pass on the message to the rest of the crew. However, they had other plans in mind. A surprise birthday party for the captain. Only one is allowed per trip, and this year was Curly's turn. Despite being the birthday boy, company policy dictates that only the captain is allowed to make the cake. Sweetener is only accessible through the code scanner, and is reserved for special occasions such as this to boost the morale of the crew. Pony Express seems to make use of some seriously exorbitant practices, but as we will soon find out, this is just the tip of the iceberg. After finishing the cake and sitting down with his comrades, Curly can no longer hold in his thoughts and breaks the bad news. With the exception of the captain, the rest of the crew is being let go. And to rub even more salt in the wound, Curly is receiving a promotion. Though the contents of the letter are never outright shown in-game, using a no-clip mod, we can make out more or less what the news entailed. The letter is cold and undetailed, and no explanation of their termination is given. It's almost as if they don't see their employees as human. Swansea doesn't seem too surprised, stating that Pony Express is one of the last manned space freighter companies. In other words, it was only a matter of time before they went under. Anya is severely distressed by the news, as she relied on this job as a primary means of finance. But the one that seems to be taking it the worst is Jimmy. He feels abandoned and betrayed by Curly, even though he had nothing to do with this. He projects his own insecurities of being seen as inferior onto Curly. The captain tries to clear things up, but Jimmy is not willing to listen. He is far too emotional at the moment. Even his attempts to show empathy for the rest of the crew somehow come across as insults. Tensions are at an all-time high. Curly was warned to only deliver the news closer to the end of their journey, but his good nature got the better of him. Maybe if he waited, things would have turned out differently. Curly awkwardly cuts the cake as the rest of the crew sit in silence. 3 months after the crash, Jimmy wakes up to the sound of Curly whimpering in pain. Checking up on our former captain, we find him to be writhing in agony. We are not sure if he has been given his pain medication. We will have to check with Anya. We find her in the cockpit, along with Swansea. They seem to be having a conversation in private. Anya is immediately startled by Jimmy's presence. She hides her face from him. There are tears running down her cheeks. Swansea looks Jimmy dead in the eyes. His words are cold and collected, and his hand is firmly clasped around the handle of the axe. We've never seen him so serious. After learning that Curly has not been given his meds, Jimmy uncharacteristically offers to administer them himself. Returning to Curly, Jimmy uses this opportunity to vent about his frustrations with the crew. He seems to get the vibe that they secretly despise him. They look at him with disgust. They know what he has done. Jimmy fears what she is going to do. She obviously referring to Anya as the only female on the ship. The new captain then goes on to blame his predecessor for putting him in this position, before taking out his anger on the man who once considered him a dear friend. Jimmy begins to hallucinate about eating a cake with Curly. Note that the dialogue from Curly reflects Jimmy's perception of him rather than the former captain's own thoughts. Curly once again talks about creating a life that he doesn't feel the need to run away from, and how we need to accept the low points in our life as it makes us appreciate the high points much more. Even in this burnt and deformed state, Jimmy still regards Curly highly, looking to him for advice. Jimmy sets off to find a knife to cut the cake, but all we can find is a bloodied axe lodged into the back of the pilot's seat in the cockpit. Jimmy seemingly feels guilty for somehow stabbing Curly in the back, but just where is this guilt stemming from? Returning to the lounge, we find Curly in his usual state, laid on the table in place of the cake. Jimmy takes the axe and makes a swing for the former captain's body. The relationship between the captain and his co-pilot seems to be more complex than we initially thought. It's very clear that Jimmy deeply admires Curly, but he also harbors a dark resentment towards him that sometimes overshadows any positive feelings he may have. Another month has gone by. The cargo hold has been raided by Daisuke and Swansea. The two have given into the temptation of mouthwash. The intern has drunk himself to the point of collapse and begins pouring his heart out to us. We learn that this internship was his mother's idea, a way to get her slacker son to do something productive for once. Despite his shortcomings, Daisuke seems like a genuinely good kid, keenly aware of his failures and just unsure of himself. He hands us his bottle of mouthwash while he lays in contemplation a while longer. After nearly jumping out her seat at the sound of Jimmy's voice, Anya informs us that there is extra medication stored in the locker outside medical. However, it has been covered by emergency foam. With our supply of painkillers running low, it might be a good idea to try and get them. Jimmy is initially apprehensive to the idea, but quickly changes his mind after realizing that he could use this as an opportunity to get the axe away from Swansea. We find the drunkard dancing his worries away, axe in hand. He casually mocks Jimmy, while continuing to bust moves in his face. This seems to irritate the self-proclaimed captain, calling out Swansea's unhelpful behavior. He also gives us a very peculiar line of dialogue that marked the start of Jimmy's delusions. He says that he's trying to save the crew, although I'm not exactly sure how acquiring a bit more medication is going to save everyone, unless he has other plans in mind, or perhaps his idea of saving is something different entirely. Swansea eventually gets tired of Jimmy's pestering and jams the axe into the screen behind him. After hacking the foam away, we collect some more pain medication as well as isopropyl alcohol. Anya praises Jimmy's efforts and kindly asks that he give Curly his medication again, as she still feels very uncomfortable doing it. This simple request causes Jimmy to lose his temper. He berates Anya for being too sentimental and claims that he does not have time to deal with such trivial tasks. He says that he is busy trying to fix things and get them through this, but his actions thus far haven't really reflected this. Jimmy proceeds to list the whopping 5 tasks he has painstakingly completed over the past 4 months. Unbelievable, I know, but he's bearing it, guys. He has to. Jimmy's idea of taking responsibility as captain is almost laughable, and his true character is becoming more and more apparent. After making all that fuss, Jimmy agrees to give Curly his medication anyway, parading himself as a hero that must bear the weight of all the crew. Unfortunately for Curly, all the oxycodone is finished, and we now only have 500 mg capsules of paracetamol. For reference, this is what is typically prescribed to alleviate a mild headache. Before force-feeding Curly the medication, Jimmy once again confides in him. He laments about the immense pressure placed upon him as captain, and apologizes for taking Curly for granted. Jimmy momentarily reflects on Anya's words, that our worst moments don't make us monsters, and then tells Curly that soon he will be captain again. But that seems borderline insane given his condition. Curly does not have the capabilities or desire to be captain again. He's barely clinging on to life, for God's sake. This is a great example of Jimmy forcing his own beliefs of what's right onto others. After receiving his meds, Curly begins crying uncontrollably. We are taken to a scene quite a bit into the future. 6 hours until Judgement. Jimmy is hiding in the cockpit, and a furious Swansea is trying to kill him. As the mechanic viciously bashes against the door, Jimmy desperately tries to reinforce it using a rope and a metal pipe. Before we can see what transpires next, we are taken back to 2 days before the crash. Curly and Anya are having a conversation in the lounge. We can gather quite a bit from both their characters from this chat. Despite lacking the nighttime window screen, Anya can't help but focus on the single dead pixel in the upper right corner. It's always there in the back of her mind. Curly, on the other hand, can't even see the dead pixel. But even if he could, it still wouldn't ruin the bigger picture for him. As much as she tries, Anya is someone who can't look past an error or a fault, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Curly is someone who will ignore or omit a defect or flaw in order to preserve the greater good. But what he doesn't realize is that a single dead pixel can sometimes bring about the destruction of the entire screen if left alone. Anya then asks Curly a very important question. that once again demonstrates the negligent practices of Pony Express. Why do you think Pony Express put a lock on the medical room door, but not the sleeping quarters? Unfortunately, Curly does not understand where Anya's concerns are coming from, and simply answers, for safety, which is painfully ironic in hindsight. 5 months after the crash, Daisuke comes running to Jimmy in a state of panic, exclaiming that Anya has gotten stuck in medical. Jimmy nonchalantly investigates the situation, though he seems more concerned about the medical supplies than Anya. After some awkward silence and vague answers, Jimmy begins to question whether the door is really stuck, to which Anya answers, "No, it's not. She has purposely locked herself in there." Jimmy belittles whatever struggles she is going through and demands that she open the door. Anya reveals that Jimmy was right all along, that she was wrong to believe that our worst moments don't define us, and that she will take care of it just as he told her to. Daisuke has no idea what she means, but Jimmy seems to understand. Although he twists the narrative to make it seem like Anya wishes to harm Curly, manipulating Daisuke into telling him about the vent that leads into medical. The vent is in the utility room, which Swansea is still guarding. He remains adamant that no one is allowed in, claiming that the room is still engulfed by foam. Jimmy quickly realizes that Swansea is not going to let them in willingly, after which the chapter ends. We are then presented with a nightmarish scene from the not-so-distant future. Daisuke has been mortally wounded, leaking buckets of blood onto the area around him. Jimmy tells him not to move, and once again deludes himself into thinking that he can fix this hopelessly perilous situation. Thankfully, Swansea calls him out on his nonsensical lip service, pointing out how ridiculous he sounds. Daisuke begins apologizing profusely, as if the situation is somehow his fault. However, we will soon come to realize that this is not the case. Swansea asks Jimmy for the isopropyl alcohol he got from the box outside medical, but the fool just mutters something about a cocktail. Jimmy then attempts to shift the blame to Swansea, claiming that he gave him no choice. This infuriates the old man, causing him to storm off in search of disinfectant. The door to medical has been opened, but the area where Curly usually lays is distorted, obstructing our vision. There is clearly something there that Jimmy does not want to see, or perhaps even something he does not care to see. There is no sign of Anya, and on the floor is a long trail of blood originating from the vent. Daisuke likely got injured climbing through it. Heading down to the cargo hold, we find a grave with Daisuke's name engraved on it, along with the pink hibiscus flower, a flower often used as an offering for those who have passed away. Not so subtle foreshadowing. Using the code scanner, the grave disappears, and we are given a glimpse into Jimmy's rotting mental state. After walking down a long flight of stairs into the cargo hold, we find a note that reads, "A blind beast, aimless and restless. You can't run from it." In this Bizzaro sequence, Jimmy is chased by a gigantic and grotesque version of the cartoon horse Polly. If he attempts to run away from the beast, he will be killed. It is very apparent that Polly is representative of a responsibility Jimmy has been running away from. Following the trail of blood on the floor, we are led to a statue of Polly holding a bottle of mouthwash. Taking it, the game immediately cuts back to Daisuke. Jimmy completely ignores Anya's warning that the mouthwash would not be effective as a disinfectant and pours the entire bottle over Daisuke's wounds. Picking up where we left off, Jimmy comes up with the brilliant idea to drug Swansea in order to access the utility room. He guilt-trips Daisuke into becoming an accomplice by once again implying that Curly's life is in danger and that they need to save him from the villainous Anya. Jimmy begins constructing an abominable cocktail of mouthwash and isopropyl alcohol, the latter of which is potentially deadly to ingest. But Jimmy doesn't care, as long as he gets to play hero. Handing over the drink to Swansea, he begins wallowing about his failures in life, and how for better or worse they shaped the person he became today. The mechanic gulps down the drink, and almost immediately collapses to the floor. Jimmy doesn't seem the least bit concerned, and just grabs the key off his unconscious body. Before opening the door, Daisuke pushes back against Jimmy's plan, and suggests that they wait for Swansea to get up before entering, but Jimmy just brushes off his concerns. Contrary to what Swansea told us, inside the utility room, we find very little emergency foam. There is even a single working cryostasis pod. Jimmy immediately assumes the worst of Swansea, claiming that his plan all along was to save the pod for himself. He refuses to consider any other possibility, as this is exactly what Jimmy would do in his shoes. With only one working cryopod, Swansea most likely kept it a secret to prevent infighting among the crew. Either that, or he was saving it for someone who had the most to live for. After collecting themselves, Daisuke points out the vent that leads to medical. Without hesitation, Jimmy orders Daisuke to climb through it. The coward doesn't even for a moment consider doing it himself. If you remember, Swansea marked the vent as strictly off limits, as the insides are almost completely collapsed. Daisuke warns Jimmy about this, but the conniving rat manipulates this poor gullible boy into believing that this is something Swansea would want, and that everyone is counting on him. Daisuke climbs into the vent, injuring himself in the process. He still somehow manages to drag his broken body into medical, where he calls out in panic to Anya. One day before the crash, Curly is looking for the ship's emergency gun, which has mysteriously gone missing. After scouring the tulpa, the captain finds Anya in the cockpit, kneeling and shaking on the ground. He suspects that she may have taken the gun to hurt herself after learning that she lost her job, but he couldn't be more wrong. Curly apologizes for not monitoring Anya's mental health more closely, and says that she could have come to him if she needed help. The captain seems to have a very big heart, and genuinely cares about each and every one of his crew, but his compassion seems to have blinded him to what has really been going on aboard the ship. Anya reveals that she was not planning to hurt herself, but hid the gun out of fear for someone else. She tells Curly that she has fallen pregnant, and that he already knows who the father is. Jimmy. Despite Anya's clearly apparent distress, Curly still naively believes that he can fix things between the two. Every line of dialogue surrounding the situation between Anya and Jimmy implies that this pregnancy was not consensual, and it baffles me that some people think otherwise. Sometime before the tulpa crashed, Jimmy assaulted Anya, which makes her behavior and actions up until this point so much more understandable. Why she was always so nervous and uncomfortable around Jimmy. Why she was so concerned about her sleeping quarters having no lock. Why forcing medication down Curly's throat was so traumatic for her. And why she locked herself in medical after being unable to bear the sight of Jimmy any longer. She was so fearful of what he would do to her after falling pregnant that she even hid the ship's gun away from him. It is never outright explained why Jimmy assaulted her, but it is most likely related to his sick desire to have power and control over others. The worst part of it all is that Curly was to some extent aware of what happened between the two of them, and clearly did not do enough to mediate the situation. He was likely more concerned about upholding the peace and functionality of the ship, possibly requiring Jimmy's skills as co-pilot, or fearing what he would do if confronted. I do sympathize with Curly. He was in a difficult situation where the solution is not entirely clear, At the time Anya fell pregnant, they were not even halfway through their journey, meaning they would still have a considerable amount of time left with Jimmy. Detaining him is not really practical, as the only two lockable rooms on the ship are medical and the cockpit, places that are vital to have access to. Jimmy would also definitely put up resistance if presented with such a situation. The only other options are to try and verbally reprimand him, which we are not sure if Curly tried already, or to use physical force, either incapacitating him or straight up killing him. Now we can argue whether the latter option is ethical or not, but Curly, being Jimmy's longtime friend, likely did not want to consider either. He possibly wanted to look past the darkness within Jimmy and believe that he could somehow change. Unfortunately, he was wrong. 6 hours until Judgement. Daisuke is on the brink of death. Jimmy still foolishly believes he can save him, but Swansea pays no attention to the idiot's rambling. His full attention is on his intern. He speaks to him softly, revealing his true feelings about him. Despite all Daisuke's shortcomings, Swansea thoroughly enjoyed their time together. He was just a damn good kid, trying his best. There was a lot a bitter old man like Swansea could have learned from him. Swansea tells Daisuke to close his eyes before relieving him from his suffering. Jimmy ironically calls Swansea a monster when it was his actions that directly led to Daisuke's death. He then tries to confront the mechanic about the cryopod in the utility room, but Swansea flips the script on him, implying that he knows what he did to Anya. She likely told him about it that night in the cockpit. Jimmy has nothing to say in response. In any case, Swansea dispels Jimmy's baseless accusations by telling him that he can have the damn pod. An old man like him has no desire for it. Jimmy still doesn't fully believe him and proceeds to retrieve the gun that Anya hid away. She was keeping it in medical. Here we find her lifeless body. She overdosed on the remaining painkillers she had Jimmy retrieve. Anya was likely planning this for a while now. Her final attempt to escape from Jimmy's clutches, as well as this hopeless situation. The cruel man doesn't even care to comment about her demise and just carries on as if nothing happened. The gun case is locked by a 3-digit code, which we can find by using the code scanner in the cockpit. Taking the gun, Curly begins hysterically laughing, finally realizing the extent of Jimmy's deranged depravity. Exiting the room, Big Swan charges straight at us with his axe. We are then shown the final flashback, 0 days before the crash. Curly speaks to Anya in medical. She tells him that she has informed Jimmy of the pregnancy and that he didn't seem to have much of a reaction. Anya begs Curly to do something about Jimmy, but he is still unsure what to do. The best solution is not so simple to him. The captain finally decides to confront Jimmy about the situation and talk some sense into him. But Jimmy, who is still hurt after losing his job, threatens Curly. He asks him what he thinks will happen when the crew finish their journey. What will happen when people find out what occurred on this ship under the captain's supervision? There's no hiding the assault. Anya will give birth before the expedition ends. Everything Curly worked for his entire career will be forgotten, and he will only be remembered for the travesty that took place under his command. Jimmy then proposes a sickening solution to the problem. The Tulpa crew are never found or heard from again. Everyone on the ship dies a tragic death, and no one survives to tell the tale. Jimmy's words make Curly momentarily hesitate. For the first time in the game, we get to see what he looks like pre-crash. The captain is clearly under a lot of stress. He is unsure how to deal with the situation, unsure what to do. He perhaps even briefly considers Jimmy's twisted plan. Jimmy taps Curly on the shoulder before walking off to the cockpit, saying that he will take care of it. By the time Curly comes to his senses, it is already too late. Jimmy has already altered the ship's course. Curly can't believe the maniac actually went through with the plan. He dashes into the cockpit in an attempt to divert the ship at the very last minute. And well, we know what happened after that. All this time, it was Jimmy, not Curly, who crashed the ship. The weasel did not want to face the consequences of his actions and lied to the rest of the crew, putting all the blame on Curly. He is directly responsible for Curly's condition, as well as leaving everyone stranded in space, and his feeble attempts to make amends thus far have only caused more destruction. But Jimmy is completely oblivious to this reality. After dealing with Swansea, Jimmy carries Curly's body to the lounge table, where the psycho has seated the bodies of his dead crewmates. He hallucinates them to be alive, celebrating his birthday. Curly whimpers at the sight of his fallen comrades, as well as the sadistic actions of his former friend. Jimmy then picks up the knife from the table and begins brutally sawing off Curly's left leg. After distributing the captain's leg meat amongst the crew, Jimmy once again expresses how envious he was of Curly's position and how inferior he felt to him. He then tells him that we're gonna make it through this, and repeats the same phrase Curly used in their previous imaginary conversation. The scene ends after Jimmy orders everyone to dig in. The next 3 chapters are highly metaphorical, but at the same time do also somewhat reflect actual events that occurred. The first of these chapters deal with Jimmy showing remorse and guilt for Daisuke's death, as well as expanding on Swansea's character. We see Swansea's key hanging over the vent in medical. Reaching for it, we fall down and see Daisuke. Approaching him, his body disappears, leaving behind a hibiscus and a pool of blood. Navigating the vent, we find a note that says, "There's no turning back now," possibly indicating that deep down, Jimmy knows it's too late to fix all the damage he has caused, and is now simply making a poor attempt to clean up the mess he made. Jimmy reminisces about some of the belongings Daisuke kept next to his bed. Perhaps he truly did feel bad about what happened to him. In the next scene, we get a glimpse of what was inside the vent that Jimmy forced Daisuke into. Sharp, protruding pieces of metal, emergency foam and loose wires, all tightly compacted into this narrow space. It is possible that Jimmy actually climbed into the vent himself during his fight with Swansea, given that an axe comes flying at us while inside. Either way, we know the two engaged in an intense battle to the death. Jimmy envisions the fight to have occurred at a mausoleum, with Daisuke's tomb at the center. Swansea put up a good fight, but Jimmy ends up coming out on top. He ties him up to a chair in utility, where Swansea gives us one last speech. He tells us about his past as an alcoholic, and how a premonition of his bloated body in a ditch turned him to sobriety. After leaving the liquor behind, he tried to turn his life around, got a job, bought a house, got married, and had kids. But even after achieving all those accomplishments, he still felt unsatisfied. If he's being completely honest with himself, the best moments of his life were the ones he spent blackout drunk. Unlike Jimmy, he's not afraid to accept the harsh truth, to see himself for what he really is. Swansea's only regret in life is not being able to protect Daisuke. He confirms our suspicion that he was saving the cryopod for his precious intern, giving him at least a small chance of escaping this hellish situation. Jimmy maintains his delusional facade to the very end, telling Swansea that he's going to fix everything as he points the gun to his head. After killing Swansea, Jimmy exits utility and heads back to Curly. He hallucinates his face beneath the metal grates on the floor, and his eyes protruding from the walls and ceiling. Jimmy's mind has been completely consumed by thoughts of Curly. The hallway eventually transitions into a fleshy tunnel, which we discover to be Curly's esophagus. Following the pathway laid out before us, we are taken to a television, playing an unsettling video of a child eating an unspecified piece of meat. Behind us is Curly, strapped to a strange contraption with valves embedded into his body. With all the food supplies having run out, Jimmy's only idea to keep Curly alive is to feed him his own leg. Curly tries his best to resist, but there's not much he can do in this condition. After enough vicious trial and error, Jimmy manages to get Curly to keep the chunk of flesh down. Looking back at the TV, Jimmy imagines one last heartfelt conversation with Curly. His perception of Curly is that of a true tragic hero who is willing to take the blame for him even after everything he has done. But that doesn't sit right with Jimmy. He wants them to both be seen as heroes. He wants to go back to being a team. For the first time in the game, Jimmy breaks down emotionally, and we get the closest thing to an apology out of him. He says that what happened was an accident, a mistake. But what is he referring to exactly? The crash, or what he did to Anya? Well, we can touch on that in a moment. But at the very least, Jimmy does deeply regret how things ended up for Curly. In this last portion of the final Bizzaro sequence, Jimmy is forced to face the consequence of what he did to Anya. A large uterus-like structure lies before him. Using some form of sonographic device, we can see a horse-shaped fetus within the fleshy mass. It moves around a bit before wailing and suddenly emerging from the womb. The screen fades to black, followed by the text, "I hope this hurts." In this scene, Jimmy must navigate the vents while avoiding the horrifying horse baby, much like how he ran away from the responsibility of his own unborn child in the real world. After escaping the monstrosity, we walk down a dark hallway, which slowly becomes filled with the crew's ID cards. Notably, Anya's ID card is buried behind everyone else's, indicating that she was the least important member of the crew to Jimmy, or at the very least the one he most neglected. The ID cards begin morphing into bottles of mouthwash, paving the path before us. On top of a massive mountain of mouthwash is Jimmy's favorite cartoon horse, Polly. The horse mocks Jimmy, who believes himself to be caged and misunderstood. Despite his bickering, Jimmy finally accepts that all of this is his fault, but still somehow believes that he can make things right. He reiterates Anya's phrase that our worst moments don't make us monsters, before being abruptly cut off by Polly, who calls out his blatant hypocrisy. If all of that is true, why is Jimmy still so concerned with Curly, but not Anya, the person who he arguably hurt the most? Jimmy is left dumbfounded, and the final chapter begins. 0 hours before Judgement, Jimmy picks up Curly off the table and takes him to the utility room. There he places Curly in the ship's last cryopod. Our perspective shifts to Curly as Jimmy says his final goodbyes, after which he walks off screen and shoots himself. As much as I despise Jimmy and what he has done, I can't help but feel sorry for him. He is clearly a very disturbed and deranged individual, showing multiple symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder. He is interpersonally exploitive, envious of others, has a grandiose sense of self-importance, and lacks empathy. Throughout the whole game, he truly believed that he was doing the right thing and taking responsibility for his actions, when in reality, it was the exact opposite. After assaulting and impregnating Anya, his attempt to fix that situation is by crashing the ship. trying to make sure there are no survivors to tell the tale. He was more concerned about preserving Curly's reputation than making amends with Anya. Jimmy has a very prominent and strange obsession with Curly and prioritized his perceived benefit over everyone else. He sent Daisuke to his doom so he could free Curly from medical, and killed both Swansea and himself so that Curly could have the last cryopod. Jimmy's way of fixing things with Curly was giving him a shot at survival, but he never stopped to consider if the captain even wanted that. Just think about it. Curly is skinned, completely immobile, and in constant pain. He was forced to watch everyone he cared about die in front of him, and he is now somehow expected to carry on living. Curly has shown multiple signs of wanting his miserable existence to end, resisting both food and medication. But now he has been obliged to continue suffering. Although his survival is not even guaranteed, he could wake up in 20 years' time to find himself all alone in the cold embrace of space, forced to die a slow and painful death. Jimmy clearly did not consider this, or perhaps did not want to. He just wanted to die believing himself to be a hero who fixed things. Though it seems in the deepest part of his mind, he is aware of what he truly is. From Jimmy's conversation with Polly, he does seem to know that what he did to Anya was wrong. He just can't bring himself to outwardly accept it, because then he will have to accept what he is. A coward, one who preys on those weaker than him, and one who runs away from responsibility. Jimmy's cowardly behavior is one of his key defining traits that was very apparent throughout the game. He did not want to take responsibility for crashing the ship, and thus diverted all the blame onto Curly. To gain access to the utility room, he drugged Swansea instead of confronting him head-on. He sent Daisuke into the vent because he was too afraid of getting injured himself. And most importantly, he took advantage of Anya and did not once show remorse for it. But Jimmy alone cannot bear all the blame for Anya's fate. Curly, while in essence a good man and captain, his inability to deal with Jimmy properly must be called into question. Now I have seen plenty of people who have villainized Curly, claiming that he is just as bad as Jimmy, which I completely disagree with. Don't get me wrong, the captain is by no means free from guilt, but the situation is a lot more nuanced and complicated than people think. So let's start by examining all the facts. We know that Curly is a decent person who deeply cares about his crew, not wanting to keep secrets from them, showing sadness when misfortune befell them, and viewing them as his responsibility. He was to some extent aware of the situation between Anya and Jimmy before finding out that she was pregnant. To what extent we are uncertain, but he does react with surprise when Anya initially tells him about the news, which could indicate that he knew of Jimmy's inappropriate behavior, but was not aware of the extent. However, I could very well be wrong about this. In any case, this is an extremely difficult situation for Curly to deal with. Firstly, Jimmy is Curly's longtime friend, with their friendship dating back to before the expedition. Curly was the one who recommended Jimmy for this position and truly believed in him. It is undoubtedly very tough for Curly to come to terms that someone close to him is actually a monster. I don't think it's fair to say that Curly purposely neglected the information Anya told him. It's a difficult situation where the best solution is not overly apparent. As I previously mentioned, the options to deal with Jimmy are very limited while in the middle of space. Simply reasoning with him very apparently would not have worked. Trying to detain him in the cockpit or medical would pose logistical and functional issues. So what options are left? Do we try to perpetually incapacitate him or just straight up kill him? These are likely the thoughts that Curly was having when trying to come up with the best course of action as captain of the ship. I've seen a lot of people be critical about Curly's lack of action, but not much of Swansea's. Anya also told him about the assault, and for 2 months he did nothing. It is only after Daisuke died that he tried to kill Jimmy. This just goes to show that even someone more confrontational like Swansea was also hesitant in this complicated situation. In the end, Curly did end up confronting Jimmy the day after he found out about Anya's pregnancy, and well, we saw how that ended. Perhaps if he tried doing this earlier, things would have turned out differently. Or perhaps there was never any reasoning with Jimmy, and he was always destined to spiral out of control. Either way, Curly paid the price for his indecisiveness. Let's just hope that one way or the other, he can finally find peace. In Mouthwashing's roughly 3-hour campaign, it is able to tell a more compelling and thought-provoking story than most big-budget AAA games. It just goes to show that a small group of people with enough passion and a great idea can outperform any of these money-hungry corporations. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, as well as supporting me on Patreon for early access and exclusive content. Thank you to all my current patrons. Your contributions are greatly appreciated. If you are a fan of indie horror games with deep and interesting narratives, you might enjoy one of these 2 videos here. Let me know your thoughts about my analysis in the comments below. As a new content creator, I am open to any feedback in order to improve. Thanks again for watching, and remember, our worst moments don't define us, as long as we take responsibility for our actions, just not in the way Jimmy did.